Previously, we spoke about the fact that without any additional configuration, our directive is functioning with the scope of its parent. In the examples we've seen, that meant that the $scope inside of our directive was the exact same object as the $scope of our directive's parent controller. While this setup seemed fine, if we look closer, we have a bit of an architectural problem here. That type of setup makes the directive dependent on our particular controller. In other words, there's too much coupling going on between the controller and the directive. Let's examine this issue in the code editor. Okay, I'm back in the code editor and I'm located in lecture 28, which is located in fullstack-course 5 examples folder. And this is just a copy of the previous application we had, the shopping list directive app. The only thing I change here is the title. And as you remember, we have a couple of shopping lists here. Both of them are marked as list in the controller as syntax. And both of them have this line right here called list item, which is our custom directive that has an ng repeat in it that's looping over our list items in our shopping list. The trouble is that we have two lists here, and when you look at this code in the code editor, it's sometimes hard to understand which list you're looking for. I guess you could look for shopping list number 2 in labels like that, but it'd be much nicer if I actually labeled our controller S syntax as a list 1 or list 2. Let's go ahead and try to do that. Let's multi-select the lists, and we'll say list 1. And here there's also a list 1, and this is a list 1, and we'll save that. Let's see, we're not missing anything, and let's go to the second list and call it list 2. Let's again try to multi-select as much as we can, and we'll say list 2, and we'll say list 2 over here and list 2 over here. So let's save that and let's go back to the browser and see if everything is working so far. So let's add cookies as usual, 3 bags of cookies, and 3 bags of cookies are working. And then let's add some chips. We'll get 5 bags of chips, and we'll add that. Okay, you know what? Actually, let's remove the chips and add some drinks instead. Let's click the remove item. Oh, look at that. It's not working anymore. Let's take a look at our Chrome developer tools, and we see absolutely no errors either. So what is going on here exactly? Let's go back and take a look at our code real quick. And we know that the list item right here, the directive, actually uses this list item.html template. And the problem should be pretty clear. We're using this list.remove item. We're relying on the fact that list is available to us on the controller scope. The problem is our list is no longer list. It's actually list 1. So let's change this to list 1. Let's go back here and we'll add, actually we'll just add a bunch of nonsense for now, and let's try to remove that. See, that works. Well, let's try to add to this list now and add that item. Let's try to remove that item. But this item doesn't work. Well, why not? List, is there any errors? Yet again, no errors. Why isn't this item working? Well, the reason this item is not working is because we're using list 1. List 1, again, is coming from the first controller, but the second controller doesn't know anything about list 1. So in order to get the second controller to work, we would have to change that to list 2. Well, then the first controller wouldn't work. Clearly, we have a problem here. What we actually want to do is re-architecture our custom directive such that it functions independently from its environment and have the environment around it pass certain values into it, just like it would pass arguments into a function. And we could do that with a concept called isolate scope. Let's go back to the slides and learn about this concept first, and then in part 2 of this lecture, we'll go back to the code editor and code up a different solution using the isolate scope concept. As I mentioned, without additional configuration, the scope of the parent is the scope of our directive. However, as I just showed you in the code, it would be better to break away from this inheritance and create an isolated scope for our directive, or as it's termed, isolate scope. The way this is accomplished is through specifying another property on the DDO called scope and assigning it some object. Without any properties, all we've done was isolate the directive scope from the parent. But if it's isolated, how do we get the data that we need into our directive? The answer is that we explicitly bind predefined attributes to the isolate scope properties. Here you see the first type of binding we're going to discuss in this lecture. We're specifying a property on the scope object called myProp. That's the name of the property that you're mapping something outside of your directive into. The value of myProp is going to be an equal sign followed by some attribute name. The attribute name is the HTML template attribute name. In the HTML template, the object value you specify here in your HTML template will be evaluated in the parent scope and passed into our directive. In this example, myProp property will be a reference to that object inside of our directive scope. There are a few ways to bind and pass the outer values into the directive. Bidirectional is probably the most communicative way. Bidirectional binding means that if you change the parent value, the value in the directive will change automatically, and vice versa. If you change the value in the directive, the parent value will change as well. If you leave the value as simply an equal sign and you don't specify the name of the attribute, AngularJS compiler will assume that the name of the attribute in the HTML template is the same as your directive's property name. In this case, myProp, or when it's denormalized for the HTML template, it will be my-prop. Also, if you follow the equal sign with a question mark, that will signify to the Angular compiler that the attribute is optional. Obviously, the code in your directive has to be aware that it's possible that the user of your directive will not supply a value for the scope property. So you cannot rely on that value to be there, as it might be undefined. In our HTML template, we specify my-prop attribute using the same normalization rules we use for the element name. In other words, we lowercase the name of the attribute and then separate its parts with a dash. AngularJS will normalize it to match it with our myProp property in the directive. Using the @ sign is yet another way to bind external values to the isolate scope of our directive. Using the @ sign tells the Angular compiler that we want to bind myProp property to the domain object model's attribute myAttribute that's located in the same element as our directive. Note that even in this case, our directive can itself be either an element or an attribute. The name of the actual attribute appearing in HTML will be denormalized version, which is my-attribute. The result value that's assigned to myProp in our directive scope in this setup is always a string. In the HTML template, we simply specify my-attribute attribute and give it the value of some interpolated string. This type of setup behaves as one-way binding, meaning that the outer value change affects the inner value. But if we explicitly change myProp that's bound to my-attribute inside of the directive, the value of my-attribute DOM node will be unaffected. Also note that there's nothing stopping us from doing the regular interpolation inside of the my-attribute. Here you could see we're concatenating the string hi and also concatenating an exclamation point sign using the plus operator directly inside the double curly braces. Okay, in part 2 of this lecture, we'll go back to the code editor and try out these features.